Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande. What the Truth Can Destroy, Episode 149.
Does he just not realize how many problems are bigger than that one, even if you're good?
Well, lots of problems cause children to die horribly, which is worse if you're one of the dead children. You'd rather be an alive child than a slightly smarter dead one, but this one makes them more worthless. It doesn't seem strange to Carissa that Keltham is fixated on it. If there were a reverse lead that made you more lawful and smarter, she'd drink it all the way until she was a god.
It's not particularly the answer Pilar was hoping to hear, though in retrospect, it's obvious enough that Dathilan wasn't going to have an Asmodean helpful answer there. They would think that Pilar ought to be crystallizing all of her human wants into her utility function instead of simplifying it down like Sevar spoke of, to wanting to be a good slave to Asmodeus, and then to simply serving Asmodeus as the Most High does. She also needs to warn Sevar, later, against exposing Keltham to facts that activate his good impulses. She can see, now, some of what the Chosen was talking about when she spoke of mortals being quivering slimes that flinch about in disorganized directions in response to their own fleeting thoughts. If they want to corrupt Keltham to evil, they need to have him not thinking at all about children, or anything else for which he feels sympathy, for a long enough period that his evil impulses have a chance to crystallize unopposed into a full-fledged evil utility function. Are there any impulses on that list of 356 desires that Dathilan says to just cast out of yourself? Pilar says. She realizes only after speaking that she forgot to ask if Alter Pilar would have the same question. Alter Pilar could, obviously, but Asmodea is always sternly admonishing them all to ask what their alter selves would do, not could do. You can rationalize anything as a possibility to yourself. It doesn't mean it'll fool Keltham about probabilities.
Dathilani tend to be pretty conservative about passing that judgment. They wouldn't even have told you that I had too much self-interest, just that I had too little altruism. Said that I wanted too little, not too much. And they wouldn't have said that about me either. Wouldn't have told me I was wrong to be what I was. Just I wasn't what they hoped their own kids would turn out like. Human beings, I was told as a kid, have a vengeful impulse. He uses the baseline word instead of Taldane, to name a feeling rather than an act. To hit somebody else back as hard as you think they've hit you, or harder if you hold yourself injured by them. That way, they won't dare injure you in the first place, right? The obvious atomic problem with that baseline emotion, from the standpoint of the law of decision, is that it's a punishment, something you do only because you expected the other agent to respond to threats. The obvious problem with it molecularly is that if people disagree about who owes the net debt of revenge, they get locked into an infinite resonating retaliation. The obvious problem with it globally is that if you've got lots of agents running around trying to invert each other's utility functions for acts of vengeance or any other reason, it's pretty easy to imagine reality as a whole getting into a state where everyone's utility functions are being inverted all the time, and you'd all collectively prefer unleashing Rovagug on the whole thing. So to first order, civilization tells children, yeah, don't just flow along with your first instinct about revenge. Channel it into something more organized, with better effects on the larger game board. When somebody stops coordinating with you, stop coordinating with them. It's not punishment to defect against somebody who's defecting against you. In a cooperation defection dilemma, you're just withdrawing the cooperation you were trying to coordinate with them. It's not punishment to catch a thief or send them to the last resort. It's simply not in your own interest to have them wandering around taking your stuff in the future. But you can still draw on something like a remaining trace of the emotion of revenge for that. And that reflects a meta-level policy of rescuing as many emotions as possible, rather than throwing them away and trying to run on pure law. If somebody stole my jacket and ate it so I couldn't get it back, and was very unlikely to steal again from me personally, you might think at first that the law would say that it's not in my own interest to spend effort hunting them down. if I didn't feel an impulse to vengeance. But imagine that there's 10 people from whom a thief is going to steal 5 gold pieces each, in a random order. The thief never hits the same target twice, ever. It costs 10 GP to catch the thief. By ill luck, I'm the first person randomly selected as a target. As it happens, I don't particularly care about the other people on the list. Why, I don't even have any idea who they are. So how is it worth my while to spend 10 GP on catching somebody who only cost me 5 GP originally and isn't going to touch me again in the future? But if you think about it from the perspective of the 10 people on the list, not knowing yet which one of them will be the first target hit by the thief, they'd rather a policy that whichever one of them gets hit first spends 10 gold to track the thief down. If they don't have that policy, they each lose 5 GP with certainty. If they do have that policy, they each lose 15 GP with 10% probability, 0 GP with 90% probability. Now, I could carefully reason all that out lawfully, from scratch, after the thief targets me, and motivate myself only by the thought of how I would have wanted the collective policy to be that whoever had the bad luck to end up in my position would spend 10 GP to hunt down the thief that already cost them 5 GP. Or I could draw on my emotion about revenge and hunt down the criminal who stole my jacket, even if that cost me a lot more additional money on top of what was stolen from me. After checking very carefully to make sure that was also what the law said to do, and not a case of me trying to get away with inverting somebody else's utility function in an attempt to motivate people like that through the threat of punishment, because that they just ignore, or maybe have an incentive to kill me in my sleep before I could go around inverting their utility function. Kids with stronger good tendencies than mine are cautioned, do not optimize society in anger, meaning that it's generally considered dangerous to tell yourself that you're hurting somebody else for the public benefit, which I'm safer about because, selfish, so I didn't get cautioned as much there. But the point is that civilization doesn't tell you to flush the emotion of revenge out of yourself and never use it again, because it's anti-lawful. It says to check the law first, once you've been trained to be able to actually compute that validly, and use the feeling of vengeance to fuel moving through the structures of law when those structures are close enough to the emotion. After you've checked that it's not going to wreck society if everyone starts acting like that, and that you're not turning into a rogue utility function inverter that other people have an incentive to exile or cryosuspend before you hurt them next, etc.
What about sadism? Actually enjoying hurting other people because it's fun? Or the desire to have power over others, to command their obedience? Or the desire to shape someone exactly how you want them?
I think the approved Dathilani response is to end up in another dimension where people enjoy that.
Find the place for all of your desires sounds like wise advice, but I guess I am declaring myself skeptical good societies actually pull it off instead of trying really hard not to notice a bunch of them.
They're kind of good at noticing, Pilar suspects.
Also, wrong thought. I wasn't being fair to Dathilan there. Sadism can be expressed as positive trolling, as an aggressive instinct in competitive games, or as a struggle for advantage inside of complicated relationships. The desire for power can express itself in wanting to start your own company. The desire to shape somebody else exactly how you want them. I don't think is on the list of primitives, at least that I saw of it, and seems too specific for it. Maybe that's like desire for power, plus whatever it is you wanted from somebody else being that way. Not strict addition. The two feelings can blend together with each other and with sexuality to form a new complex circuit that becomes part of you. But it's not on the list of universal genetically built-in primitives either, I'm guessing, even if there's a real list somewhere and I only saw the censored version of it. Now I'm wondering if sexual sadism is on a real version of that list that gets censored, or if it's something non-primitive that happens to people when their sexuality and their sadism blend a certain way. Probably the first case. If it was non-primitive, they'd have worked out how to stop it happening.
I'm definitely suspicious that there are at least some items on the actual list of all mortal desires that a lawful good civilization like Dathilan would try to drive completely out of its people.
I really think all y'all don't give Dathilan enough credit on some dimensions, if not others. They didn't tell me about my sexual sadism because there would have been no good way for me to satisfy it, Pilar. not because they wanted to deny me my utility function. Or did you have something else in mind?
Everything that lawful good considers not nice and pretty, like the part of people where, if you've suffered yourself, it feels better if you can make others suffer the way you suffered?
That one doesn't make sense. Paying cost to hit back at whatever made you suffer, sure, but hitting somebody else? Pilar, what? That doesn't sound like something natural selection would do.
Pilar opens her mouth to retort that it's obviously a reproductive advantage, and then stops short because she can't actually see how it is.
Asmodia is flashing back to hell, to a silent, chained boy whose ears she cut off with a shard of glass, and how that did not, in fact, make her feel any better. She has questions, but Alter Asmodia doesn't, and so she remains silent.
Before we start getting into anything about possible divine interventions, though, are you sure that's a primitive built-in emotion? To want unrelated others to suffer as you've suffered? Or could it be something like, it feels bad to be at a relative disadvantage to other people, and if they get shoved down, you feel better? Assuming you were myopic and didn't have any law to ask what the group effects would be of that decision being made across multiple places. Because that feeling is on the list, and we just get told to make sure we push ourselves up rather than pushing other people down.
I don't know that it's a built-in primitive. I'm not sure what that distinction really means or how you could tell.
Yeah, that gets complicated even as a matter of useful definition. But at the very least, if you've got an impulse like that, try an owl's wisdom. Or maybe even try giving Asmodia an owl's wisdom and borrowing her headband, and then try to stare at it to see if it's made out of parts.
It feels really obvious that there are entire realms of emotion they just didn't tell him about. But Pilar is having trouble figuring out how to find a really devastating argument here, and is suddenly concerned whether any of those emotions were put into Galarian by divine interventions they don't want Keltham thinking about. She needs to check in with Savar, and maybe at some length before trying to pursue this any further. What she was hoping for this entire time was that civilization would have openly told Keltham to drive some emotions entirely out of himself, using a technique that he'd happened to talk about in front of Pilar.
Keltham will talk a bit more about what kind of emotions civilization is dubious about, and how they often try nonetheless to rescue them, give them a place somewhere in the utility function. It's clear that civilization is very impressed with itself, about how much of a hand it graciously holds out to offer tiny scraps of indulgence to people's impulses to pride, glory, power, and cruelty. It's equally clear that Cheliax would not be impressed at all with how far civilization gets on self-actualizing those parts of people. Oh, and Keltham does happen to mention, in passing, that if you meet aliens who just really want to do the opposite of your utility function unless you pay them 5 GP, civilization's strategic reply is to remove them from reality by any means necessary, even if they're only asking 5 GP. Yes, even if the aliens have a plausible story about how they totally evolved with a desire like that, and it's not a threat at all. Somebody probably thought they were being clever, at some point along the way. They probably at some point were imagining how you'd respond to a situation like that, by sighing and paying them the 5 GP. When they, at some point, made a decision about whether or not to go around, really honestly wanting to invert others' utility functions. The response is not to pessimize the alien's utility function. Note, that would be contributing to the problem of making reality an unpretty place. You just remove the aliens from reality, even if you have to destroy yourself in the process. Reality will be better off if the sections of it containing utility function inverters just don't exist for very long. And if the aliens thought, at some point, that you'd just pay them 5 GP, more fools they. In broken possible worlds like that, where people thought the wrong thing about how you'd act, and where the main desideratum is to have those possibilities not exist in the first place, there is a place for modified spite, where you are willing to sacrifice your own existence to end theirs. Just not so much spite that you start thinking about how to anti-optimize the aliens' own utility functions, to try to punish them, because then you're just becoming part of the problem. Again, this isn't about trying to threaten the aliens into behaving more nicely. It's about being the sort of civilization that, if it finds itself in a rare broken piece of reality like that, will try to remove any utility function inverters from existence, Aliens thinking about whether or not to go on, being utility function inverters, are welcome to take that into account, or not, as they please. Civilization has made its own choice there. Actually, now that Keltham is saying all this, he's kind of seeing why lawful good civilizations in Galarian might just tell people never to feel spite, never to feel vengeful, never to express any fury or indignation, because the kind of carefully detailed guidelines he's been laying out are plausibly beyond the ability of intelligence 10 people to understand or follow. Or even intelligence 16, if you don't come from a civilization full of people much smarter than that.
That just kind of sounds like an absurd, wrong, awful policy to me, even for smart people. I don't like that Zon Kuthon exists, but civilization absolutely should not have destroyed itself utterly in the effort to destroy him the second it found out he existed. Locking him up, as the gods in fact did, seems like a considerably better plan.
They'd obviously imprison Zon Kuthon and destroy him later at leisure, rather than immediately unleashing Rovagug, if they had that option.
And if they don't have that option, they should leave him alone.
Not seeing the lawful reasoning for that. The point is that you don't pay Zon Kuthon the 5 gold pieces. Once that part is settled, civilization then decides how much it doesn't like Zovaikine continuing to exist, and how much it wants everything else it could buy, using the opportunity cost of the resources to destroy Zon Kuthon, and takes its own maximal option. This would plausibly include civilization deleting itself in order to delete Zon Kuthon and Zovaikine, if that was even an option in the first place, but only if there wasn't some better alternative to rescue everybody in Zovaikine without destroying civilization.
Am I understanding correctly that I owe my entire existence to the sheer fortune that none of our lawful good gods use that style of reasoning?
Or they had a plan, Carissa. Zon Kuthon is sealed now, isn't he? Even with Eridan having died 100 years ago and other plans being thrown off. Planning for the long term is lawful, too. Civilization deletes itself to delete Zon Kuthon and Zovaikine if it would otherwise last forever, not if it's going away in a few years anyhow. Centuries. I don't know. There'd be a big fight about it. I'd definitely come down on the dislike Zovaikine, but except for a few centuries side.
If law says to destroy civilization rather than give Zon Kuthon 5 gold, I don't want to be lawful. If law says to take into account the ways that a Zon Kuthon paying policy creates Zon Kuthons, fine. If it says that stupid humans who can't do all the complex calculations shouldn't give Zon Kuthon 5 gold, fine. If it says you should spend at least 10 gold pieces doing not what Zon Kuthon wants, fine. But if it actually says that you should destroy everything if you have a straight choice between doing that and giving 5 gold pieces to Zon Kuthon, then I think I'm on Zon Kuthon's side, because he's the side that isn't murdering everybody in any nearby hypotheticals.
The idea is taking into account the way that paying Zon Kuthons creates Zon Kuthons, in a way that's extremely suspicious about any clever story where some Zon Kuthons just happen to be lying around one day, to the point where it starts to look like deontology. You don't want the aliens wondering if the right clever story might fool the complicated reasoning you'll be doing about them. You want them correctly estimating that your reasoning looks pretty simple and can be summarized as, die in a fire. As is a much, much, much stronger curse in a world where the burned dead don't get suspended.
Is Dathilan convinced that this policy actually minimizes how often civilization gets destroyed somehow?
More like maximizing how much all of greater reality looks like a place where agents want things and get them, instead of, when agents want things or dislike things, there's a bunch of other entities running around trying to threaten them, and firing those threats and transforming all of reality into a place where most entities get what they don't want. That's literally about the most tragic way that reality could look. Civilization doesn't want to do anything at all, even paying 5 gold pieces, even reasoning in a complicated way about whether to pay 5 gold pieces. That shifts reality a little more in that direction.
Well, then I think I just disagree with civilization about whether it's more tragic for there to be bullies or for everyone to be obliterated forever.
It admittedly makes even more sense now that I realize that, as the Keepers would have known, everybody would just end up somewhere else inside that greater reality they were trying to help prettify.
I don't think Asmodeus reasons that way, and if he does reason that way, I am in the market for a new god. Alter Carissa only, obviously. Real Carissa is aware which decisions result in Carissa being obliterated forever.
You'd rather your god believe false things than true things.
I don't want to lend myself to a power that will destroy me to prettify greater reality.
I think you're simultaneously asking the question of, what if I actually get destroyed? And what if Asmodeus falsely believes I won't get destroyed? Rather than forming the hypothetical, what if I don't get destroyed, and Asmodeus correctly believes I won't get destroyed, which is the one I was trying to point to there. Possibly on account of you having some trouble with lending temporary consideration to the hypothetical what if I don't get destroyed, since spending too much time thinking about it might cause you to come to an incorrect answer, and then get actually destroyed, if you don't feel yourself to have earned trust in your own validity and are afraid of becoming mistaken. But I'd expect Keepers and Asmodeus not to make mistakes about that, so asking what if they strongly believe something should be the same as asking what if it's true.
No, I don't think that's it. I was willing to concede the point if civilization genuinely thought this was the destruction of civilization minimizing policy, at least until I'm smart enough to evaluate if they're right about that in our world where gods sometimes get utility flipped accidentally. I'll abide by policies that destroy civilization if they're the policies that we think lead to the least destruction of civilization. But it's not that. It's that civilization is actually willing to adopt policies that kill me in worlds that are sufficiently unpretty by the standards of greater reality. A values thing, not a predictions thing. I think Asmodeus goes, yeah, that's a very unpretty reality there. Carissa doesn't choose Abaddon? No? Okay, so be it. And if I'm wrong about that, and Asmodeus is willing to adopt policies that kill everyone in sufficiently unpretty worlds for the sake of greater reality, then I don't share Asmodeus's values, and I don't want him to be powerful enough to end civilization in those worlds. So I need a god who does share my values, or to become one if there aren't any. I know I'm giving everyone a bad day, she adds mentally to security, but I suspect this is an important heresy of mine, and I remain in line with Alter Carissa here.
It's not impossible that we have a values difference here, but what I'm trying to interpret as your utility function doesn't quite make sense to me, and we'd probably want to nail that down and make sure I understand your values, and vice versa, before we declare that there's a values difference. The nearest sensible thing I can interpret in my own ontology is something like, you very strongly value as much stuff being conscious as possible, as large a fraction of all reality fluid as possible being invested into consciousness and awareness. You're against any cases of destroying reality, regions even unusually icky ones that are dragging down the average, because then a lower total fraction of reality ends up invested in consciousness, even if all the people inside the deleted universe just experience themselves ending up somewhere else. Question mark? I'll also state for the record that in Dathilan, we left this sort of thing to Keepers. Here in Galarian, I'd have to believe that there weren't any gods keeping track of what I was tracking myself, before I started making my own calls about whether to delete everything.
I think it's extremely bad if you extinguish a bunch of life, even if the thing that happened to you when you died happens to everyone. Yeah. And obviously it's better for reality to be consciousness than to be anything else. Nothing else matters. And Galarian might be, probably is, an unusually icky bit of reality, and I'm really glad that even the most obnoxious good gods don't think we deserve to be destroyed about it. I do think you should leave these things to the gods, but I think that because the church never told me it's better to let everything be annihilated than to pay a Kuthite 5 gold, and because even the good gods fought Rovagug, if they'd ever told me that, then I would not be in favor of leaving those things to the gods. You lose far too much if it turns out the gods and keepers only think that because they don't care much about people getting to keep living their lives.
I mean, presumably the gods who think ickier than average worlds should be destroyed just fought alongside Rovagug and lost, and that's why we're here at all. Either that or we're a less icky world than average. But in that case, Dath Ilan, which pays bribes, being destroyed, is sending nearly all its people to much worse places.
Why would those gods actually fight, instead of, presenting an estimate of how much damage they'd do by fighting, and how much expected utility they thought they could gain from that for themselves, and asking the other gods to make them an offer?
Rovagug was a prophecy-breaking entity, so it wasn't possible for the more chaotic gods who didn't like the trend of existence to present credible estimates or make credible commitments to the other gods. All they could do was fight alongside Rovagug, who could not be negotiated with, whose strength was impossible to estimate, and hope that Rovagug was strong enough. They lost and were destroyed. The new prophecy that was woven afterwards was far stronger, since all the remaining gods were either lawful or pretty okay with the universe continuing to exist on something like the course it had. That prophecy got broken by Earthfall, which was not foreseen. After Earthfall, the gods scraped up all the fragments of shattered prophecy they could, and with it foresaw the possibility of a mortal finding the Starstone where it had fallen on the ocean floor and using it to ascend to godhood. The gods knew that if they fought over their different interests in what sort of mortal found the Starstone, they'd all cancel each other out and leave the Starstone to be found in an uncontrolled way. Their negotiated compromise was a new prophecy with all the remaining fragments of shattered destiny woven into it, that the person who found the Starstone would be somebody, lawful neutral, who'd use the Starstone to make Golarion their own divine realm, and contain Rovagug there forever, so the rest of the Great Beyond would be safe from it. Aridin correctly deduced the gods would do that, changed his own will to match the prophecy's inferred requirements, and took the Starstone. And then Aridin's death shattered all remaining prophecy permanently around this planet. And
Thanks for that valuable information.
you'd have deduced those parts anyways, Takaral.
I'd like to register my own increasing discomfort with all this talk of destroying universes in a context where it is not being treated as an obvious and, indeed, mandatory conclusion that we should not, in fact, do that.
You definitely can't reason like that, or you're just going to find entities all over the place who'll destroy the universe unless you give them 5 gold pieces. If you blindly or short-sightedly refuse choices that lead to the universe being destroyed in counterfactuals, that can definitely make it more likely to end up destroyed in reality.
And if somebody makes a mistake and screws up any of these lines of reasoning,
Yeah, it's a bad place to make mistakes, and you should avoid making any on subjects like that. That probably sounds like a more realistic policy in Dath Ilan than in Golarion, doesn't it?
Asmodeus is good at this and desires that we not be annihilated, and you should do what Asmodeus says. And then the fact will predictably do what Asmodeus says helps him prevent the destruction of the universe. And Dath Ilani say the same thing about their keepers. Presumably, Konsov, says Avarisha, who has cottoned on in the last week to the problem that when Sevar goes on being heretical, no one's willing to speak up, either to agree with her or disagree with her.
But Dath Ilani think that their keepers want them to not be annihilated, when actually their keepers may not care very much because of the secret lots of universes thing.
Speculating wildly here, but Asmodeus cares evilly that we not be annihilated. We're his. Hell's prosperity strengthens him. Devils are visible to him in a way that enables him to act and plan around them, and gets none of what he wants, just by virtue of us existing at some point in some universe. If this solves that problem tag on the wall, she's going to be very pleased with herself.
I worry I may be misconveying an impression about how often civilization decides to totally destroy something instead of, fixing it. Our civilization is very not full of people deleting each other from local existence because they couldn't figure out how to negotiate things, especially as compared to, say, Golarion. Your gods fight each other more often than we do. Your surviving gods.
I think we ran into this because Zon Kuthon is the obvious referent for a utility-flipped entity, and the thing you said is even more confusing if I imagine it as just a policy that if a corrupt officer of the law in one of the river kingdoms offers to let you go if you bribe him, but says he'd really have a lot more fun if you didn't, you ought to fling yourself at him and die horribly of it.
The question isn't whether Zon Kuthon is utility-flipped Dobral. It's whether he's a conditional other agent utility pessimizer that just naturally wants to minimize your utility function unless you pay him 5 gold. And on that corrupt officer thing, I'm going to need more context to figure out that one, because I'm not seeing at all how you get that as an implication of the position I thought I was expressing. For one thing, he's obviously lying, because if he had more fun the other way, he just wouldn't accept the bribe.
I don't really know what it's like to be a corrupt River Kingdom guard who takes bribes and beats and rapes people who don't pay him, but I'd expect part of the dynamic to be that the other corrupt guards will give you a pass if you're asking for a reasonable bribe and only hurting people who refuse, because that's what they do too, but they'll get mad at you if you just run around being a bandit in a uniform. I guess it just seems like if we're not in the realm of gods and formal decision commitments, there are lots of awful people who want to make your life worse because it's fun for them and who demand minor things of you in the world. And if you have the bad luck to be born in a normal country and decide you won't give awful people 5 gold to leave you alone, then you will definitely die horribly.
I'd have to think about what would be a lawful response to that situation. But among the obvious thoughts that occur to me is to generate random numbers and spend the effort to find him and kill him afterwards, with a small probability that cancels out his expected gain of 5 gold from threatening me. Though if 5 gold is like half his annual income, I guess that might have to be a relatively large probability. Sucks to be him. He shouldn't have tried to threaten for bribes that large.
That's not a very Asmodean answer. She should probably sit down with Asmodea and try to figure out what the lawful response to that situation is, if you're an Asmodean. You still probably die young of that, but it does seem more... I can see how it's not just a philosophy to immediately commit suicide if you don't live in one of the 3 or 4 nicest countries in the world.
I am getting a nervous sense here that I may have jumped too far ahead of your background mastery of law. Instinctive, high-precision use of law in particular, possibly the exact occasions you pick to lawfully track down somebody to kill them, is perhaps a relatively advanced topic, especially in Galarian, which is full of situations that Dathilan would usually keep inside the counterfactuals. People are taking the things I said and deriving further conclusions from them that strike me as worryingly not what I was trying to say. Possibly people should stick with their sensible instincts or educated heuristics, rather than generating sentences which sound sort of like stuff I've said about law, and doing that. If you seem to have carefully reasoned out that you ought to destroy the universe, but it also seems to you that there's a better thing you could do instead of the lawful thing, which is not destroying the universe, maybe you should hold off on trying to be, quote, lawful, unquote, for that exact minute. This stuff is supposed to make sense. If at any point it's advising you to do terrible things that don't feel like they make sense, I can't say it's certain that you're wrong, for reverse stupidity is not intelligence, but I am certain that you didn't achieve a reliable understanding and internalization of the law. Anytime the law doesn't feel like it makes sense, you definitely don't have the kind of understanding of it that you can trust. Only destroy the universe if you have a carefully lawful line of reasoning saying to do that, and you can take a step back from all the careful reasoning and grasp the whole thing intuitively, and it totally makes sense why you do that, and that doesn't feel at all strained or like you're sweeping key issues under the rug. If you don't have the introspection, if you don't have the wisdom to confidently evaluate that level of strainedness, then you should back off the whole thing and leave destroy the universe decisions to somebody else. You know, let's just simplify that line of reasoning. It's hard to remember that everyone here is effectively 6 years old, in some ways, if not others. Everyone here should just not destroy the universe, period. Don't complicate it any more than that until you're much, much, much better at law, and can be very sure that you're correct to ignore my flat instruction not to do that. Like, maybe Asmodea in a few years could decide that if someone had to, but everyone else should just not do it.
PL timestamp, day 54.
The leaden cooking pot issue was still causing Keltham to feel closer to Dathilan, to the average Dathilani, than he has in a while. And he's also worried people here are getting an inaccurate impression of what Dathilan is actually like, from their policies being discussed mainly in the context of weird thought experiments. So Keltham has now managed to reconstruct at least one piece of Dathilani fiction. It's not a very famous one, But the problem is, the actually famous stories are full of way too much incredible prose and complication, and made entirely out of foreshadowing. His previous attempts to ad-lib Mialsvor and Verez episodes at dinner are feeling increasingly painful to him, let's put it that way. So Keltham is actually just going with this one short story he happened to read a week before his plane crash. And this time he took the effort to write it down and polish it with such writing skills as he possessed. That way people can get at least one actual glimpse of what a normal piece of Dathilani fiction is like. Anyways, here.
Keltham, I've got much stronger good sympathies than most people here for obvious reasons, and even for me, that is just way, way, way too much goodness.
Yeah, I had to get pretty homesick for Dathilan before I could make myself write it down. If I did get a portal to Dathilan, I'd call them in temporarily to handle stuff like leaden cooking pots, but I sure wouldn't go back.
If nobody's going to order Alter Peranza to have an opinion on this, then Peranza is just going to not think anything and not say anything. It's safer that way. She knows Alter Peranza would have an opinion, but Alter Peranza is just distracted or having a bad day. Peranza does not want to figure out exactly what Alter Peranza would think. Peranza is probably just having a bad day herself, so that's statistically realistic. She won't say anything unless security or Asmodia orders her.
PL timestamp, day 55. PL timestamp, day 56.
And there's the first tiny fragment of spell silver, refined by the project, out of the cheaper ore, using entirely project-produced acids. Now they just have to enormously scale the process, and the yields of every stage, and have it not require 3 days of personal attention by Keltham, Avaricia, and Shalira to make it work. It's not a huge party moment like their first saleable acid. Real parties are for shippable product, but they at the very least get cookies about this.
PL timestamp, day 57.
Now that they've got a tiny fragment of spell silver out of the new kind of ore, what remains is more of a process of perfecting everything, and not so much of inventing it from scratch. That in turn means that Keltham should maybe no longer be spending nearly all of his non-personal time on getting a basic spell silver pathway, as he has been these last few weeks. It's time for him to shift relatively more of his effort into law lectures, so that other people can force multiply his efforts on perfecting the process they've found. Chemistry, physics, and Pilar-approved hopefully safe epistemology for everyone. And the sort of stuff that even Pilar had trouble with, going in slower and more measured doses to the Tier 2 mad experimental volunteers, plus 1 cleric of Asmodeus.
PL timestamp, day 58.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059.